Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking a little bit about gross national happiness and bringing it into business, which seems an unlikely field for the next half hour or so. And it's a real delight to be here and to be invited by this wonderful group and the Wisdom Together movement. Just to say a little bit about how I ended up in Bhutan. You know, my own background was as a medical doctor. I grew up in Canada. And for a good part of my training, I felt like I had the tools I needed to be addressing the patients that were coming up to my office. But over time, I became more interested in public health, and at one point volunteered with UN volunteers to work in South Africa at the height of the HIV epidemic. And at that point, I came across a kind of poverty, a material poverty, that I had not encountered in my life before. And it was a bit of a shock. And at the same time, I was doing surveys and going to households in rural communities in dwellings that looked like that, where the first thing that would happen was the head of household, who was usually a single mother, would tell me that there was no food in the house and that the children had not really eaten for the past 2 days. And then without a second's hesitation would ask me if I wanted tea and would I like something to eat. And I was so touched by the kind of generosity that I saw in that context. It made me wonder a little bit about poverty, development, and happiness. I would also come to celebrations in the village where I would see this kind of joy and dancing as people celebrated together many of the community ties that kept them close. And at the same time, I would travel to London to be doing my Masters of Public Health, where I'd be sitting in the tube in situations like that, where if you showed up with a smile and said hello to your neighbor, people would look at you as if there was something wrong with you. So again, that made me question, what is this thing called development? And at that time, I was invited to start working at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in New York, where I had a chance to explore that question more deeply. And it was at that time I started living a very busy life as someone in Manhattan. I noticed my own level of stress going up and my own ability to be present diminishing. And it was at that time that I had the good fortune to meet the then Prime Minister of Bhutan, who was speaking about happiness as a new development paradigm. And to my surprise, I was invited to help write the report to the UN, which led to me ending up in Bhutan. So a bit of a story of my own journey of happiness, which has also brought me here to Oslo. I want to talk to you a little bit about what is happiness, because that's a question people often ask when you talk about G&H, and it's important to unpack it a little bit. I want to talk about what we know about happiness from social epidemiology, neuroscience, economics, just touching lightly on it because I think it's important. And finally, I want to share a little bit about why happiness and G&H might be important for business, talking particularly about the work we've been doing with a large business in Thailand. So what do we mean by happiness and gross national happiness? The fourth king of Bhutan ascended to the throne at the age of 17, and he had the wisdom to ask the people what they wanted of him and to travel from village to village, often on foot or horseback. And what he heard from them over and over was a sense of wanting to be happy, wanting to be connected with each other, wanting to know themselves and be in community with each other. And he came up with a phrase when asked by an Indian reporter, what is the GNP? What is the gross national product of Bhutan? He responded, in Bhutan, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. And this was back in the 1970s, and that's when that phrase was first coined. Since then, the world has taken a great interest, and Bhutan has made a lot of progress in measuring and articulating what that might look like. So I think it's important to point out that happiness, when we talk about G&H, is not just a feel-good feeling. It's not the feeling when the sun is shining or somebody compliments you. That's more like hedonia. It's a passing mood, and it doesn't last. It's not really a basis for guiding a country or a business come up with policy. So if we're not talking about hedonia, what are we talking about when we talk about happiness? And here's a quote from the Princess of Bhutan, who is the patron of our G&H Center. And she talks about it in the context of a good life, understanding the meaning of happiness and making it a serious goal in life. And in Bhutan, the government has decided that happiness is the ultimate desire of every individual, and by extension, it's the responsibility and purpose of the state to create the necessary conditions that enable citizens to live a good life. So what an extraordinary vision for a government, not just to pursue economic growth and assume that it will trickle down into happiness, but to say, let's cut to the chase and let's say that happiness of the people is what we're aiming for. Now, some of you may think, oh, this could only work in a small Buddhist country in the Himalayas, or maybe it's a very Eastern idea. But if we were to go to the roots of Western philosophy and to Aristotle, he would have defined eudaimonia as a flourishing life, a good life, a life of meaning, which is very much a part of the Western understanding. Also, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States, articulated the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So although we may have gone quite a far astray from that in the United States at present, it is in the language of the Constitution. So we can't really talk seriously about happiness without thinking a little bit about unhappiness, and particularly in the times that we're living in right now. Otto Scharmer from the Presencing Institute, who is also a dear friend, will be speaking with us tomorrow, and he often speaks of 3 fundamental disconnects or divides, which are leading to both personal happiness and a lot of social instability and crisis that we're witnessing. One is our disconnect from ourselves, the other is a disconnect with others, and finally our disconnect with nature. So our disconnect with ourselves, I think many of us are aware that depression now ranks as one of the highest causes of morbidity in developed and middle-income countries. We're seeing an epidemic of stress and burnout in all walks of life. These are in countries that are seemingly doing well, industrialized, developed countries. And there's been an increasing question of the role of consumerism and social comparison in driving the sense of alienation that we are increasingly feeling. It's an irony that in this digital age, where all of us are more than ever connected on Facebook, Twitter, mobile phones, and so on, we're seeing waves of loneliness being reported in many of our cities. And it's hitting not just elderly people who are isolated in their homes, but young people, adolescents, in a way that's not been seen before. And we know from global research that our sense of community, the sense that somebody will look after you if something happens, is really vital to our sense of well-being. And yet, if you look at a lot of the surveys, we're seeing growing social inequalities and isolation in many of these countries that are progressing in terms of GDP. In terms of disconnect from nature, this is where I think many of us are concerned with the environment to know that actually this past year and the year before it were the highest recorded temperatures in human history. Climate change is no longer something that can be denied, and scientists using NASA data are saying that it's actually progressing faster than they anticipated, and that human activity is really the main contributor to that. So our disconnect to the environment is threatening our very survival. So in that context, the first Prime Minister of Bhutan, who brought G&H to the United Nations, came up with what I think is a really profound and healing definition of happiness. And he would say that true abiding happiness cannot exist while others suffer, but comes from serving others, living in harmony with nature, and realizing our own innate wisdom. So that's a very deep definition that encompasses that connection to self, others, and nature. So to speak of G&H and happiness, I think it's helpful to think about it as creating the outer conditions where people can be happy. That's certainly the role of government. You might think, how can a business also do that? And also creating the inner conditions for happiness. Because as Alfred was saying at the beginning, the world that we perceive, the world that we engage with, is to an extent created in our own minds and hearts. So how can we work on both of those levels? And here's a short video from the G&H Center with one of my colleagues, Dr. Toha Van, where we talk a little bit about both of those dimensions. And I wanted to include it because I want to bring a little bit of Bhutan's fresh air into Norway. I think we have sound.
When we look at GNH, so gross national happiness, I think there's two fundamental dimensions. One dimension is structural and systemic. So it has to do with rethinking the way we measure development and progress, the way we structure our society. So it's really a structural dimension of what are the conditions that have to be brought about in a society to enhance or to create the enabling condition for happiness and well-being to flourish. And the other dimension is what we often call happiness skills, which has to do with a shift in consciousness, has to do with transforming the mind, cultivating the mind and the heart. So these are two elements that have to come together. Usually these are two separate things, but it's very rare that these two are connected. And I believe that one of the unique features of GNH is that it connects to both. That on one hand you need structural change, because changing your consciousness without changing the circumstances, the social context will not be enough. But you cannot really change the social structures if you don't also have a change in consciousness, because social structures are nothing but a embodiment or a manifestation of thought patterns, of ways we relate to one another, of the mind, of the thinking. So we have to work on the two levels simultaneously.
GNH can be practiced as a way of life, and it doesn't even have to be consciously called gross national happiness as a way of life. It's, I think, simplifying your life and really trying to live in balance with nature. I think it's about living with some truth in your values, not feeling swept up and caught up in a kind of materialist culture where you're constantly chasing after the next fix. I think that can be done anywhere. I think people are longing for that kind of a life, but it does mean challenging the current system. It's a little bit swimming upstream at the moment. I think people are feeling like they're not living lives the way that they would want to. They're very much pressured by their jobs, by many demands. They're not happy with the way that they're consuming. Living GNH can be a very personal thing, and it doesn't require a huge statement. It can be really about questioning and reflecting on what values are important to you, and then making small changes in your life to try and be in harmony with that.
So I hope you felt that fresh breeze of Bhutan, and being here in Norway, I really felt the resonance between these two countries and the reverence for nature. So how do we create the outer conditions for happiness? You may have heard of 9 domains that gross national happiness measures in their survey. I won't go into them in great detail here because I'll be covering them in the workshop this afternoon. But maybe just to say they include things that many surveys would include, like health and education, living standards. Of course, they're important. But other unusual things like time use. How are we using our time? How much work-life balance do we have? And what is the strength of our communities? These are measured in the GNH survey. I want to talk now a little bit about the science and what do we know about happiness, because I think this is a field that has become extremely active in the last 10 or 15 years and is very relevant to what we're talking about. One of the take-home messages is that wealthier countries are not necessarily happier countries. Now, that's not to say that economic development doesn't matter. Having worked in some of the poorest countries in the world, I know that having enough to eat, having a roof over your head is definitely important. But science has shown that once countries reach a certain level of GDP growth, a certain level of development, increasing GDP doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness. And the United States is a classic example. In the US, we know it's one of the biggest economies in the world, but in the World Happiness Report survey, they dropped down to 17 in terms of happiness in that country. And that's below much less developed countries like Costa Rica. It's interesting that GNP per capita has tripled since 1960, but life satisfaction in the US has remained the same. That's the blue line on the bottom, and GNP growth is the orange line there. And why is that the case? Community trust is breaking down in the US. Trust in the government and the feeling that businesses and government cannot be trusted has increased. And the lack of meaningful and secure work in the US has diminished. All of this is leading to a lot of social and upheaval that we're witnessing now, and a decline in happiness. So what is wrong with GDP if we're going to talk about gross national happiness in distinction to GDP? A little bit about the history. It came about and was used by the World Bank and the IMF in the 1940s after the Great Depression, and at that time was seen as a figure that would help predict ups and downs in economic growth. Reasonable design. It measures only marketed economic activity, and it says all this is positive. So if you were to take all of beautiful Norway's trees and chop them down, GDP would go up, and no measurement of what the impact on the environment would be. Similarly, GDP is problematic because of what it doesn't measure. So if you were to look after your own child, for example, or if you were to look after your own aging parent, that would not increase GDP, but if you were to put them into a nursing home and let somebody else take care of them, GDP goes up. So again, there's no valuing of things that we do that create happiness and well-being that are free. That's another problem with GDP. But somehow it's been now taken as a reflection of a country's progress and status in a way that was actually never intended, even by Simon Kuznets, who designed that figure. I was researching Norway's beloved Arne Næss. I was invited to speak at the Arne Næss Symposium here. And it's interesting that back in the 1980s, he was very critical of GNP, as it was called back then. And he says it doesn't imply any growth to intrinsic values and progress, to anything that matters. In fact, it's probably just a reflection of our lack of ability to engage in meaningful activity, and really just the fierceness of our activity, our busyness. And he, at that point, he pretty much predicted that it would be a real barrier to sustainability because it focuses only on wants and not needs. A little bit of good news on happiness is coming from the neuroscience field, and I know we'll hear about some of this during the course of the 2 days. We're now finding that meditation and mindfulness, the ability to cultivate happiness skills, is possible in adults as well as in small children. And it really can enhance our resilience, our ability to deal with negative situations, and our ability to maintain positivity even in the face of uncertainty and difficult circumstances. A skill that we may all need sooner than we think if the world is progressing with the rate of instability that we're seeing. So happiness and well-being can be seen as skills that can be enhanced through training, and this is research from Richard Davidson and Brianna Schooler. So exercising our minds should be approached much as the same way as we exercise our bodies. And I'll bring this into how we're working with some of the companies next. So why are happiness and G&H important for business? I think there's growing research on happiness, as I mentioned, and it's being more and more applied to business. I think for some time now, business has been paying attention to employee well-being, both for the reasons of burnout and high turnover, but also realizing that happy employees, creative employees, can also be more productive and are more likely to stay in a job if they feel actually it's in alignment with their life purpose. More and more we've been hearing about the Sustainable Development Goals and the importance of the triple bottom line, promoting companies that are looking at people, profit, and planet. And happiness and well-being is seen as being very important for that. So the beginning of that shift in the consciousness of business. I think another important reason related to sustainability is what we're witnessing in relation to climate change. I think any of us reading the newspapers these days and focusing on what's happening in the United States have been very disturbed by a couple of events. One, I was speaking in Bhutan at a recent Business and G&H conference and checking my mobile phone every few moments to see what was happening in the US as Hurricane Irma was making its way through there. And it was been described as a catastrophic hurricane beyond anything that the meteorologists could have explained. And 6.8 million people were told to evacuate Florida, the largest evacuation in US history. As we're speaking now, Northern California, do we have any people from California here? Some hands go up. The uncontrolled wildfires sweeping through the country, not just the economic impact on the wine country there, but houses being devastated, people evacuated. 11,000 firefighters have been battling what they call the greatest tragedy to strike California. So at the same time, we know we're facing a huge climate change leadership crisis among those holding formal power, people that we've often elected to power. And so who's going to fill that gap? And there's a lot of attention being paid to business leaders as being holding a very important role of responsibility in shifting us towards sustainability. I was invited to the World, not the World Economic Forum, the World Government Summit in Dubai in February of this year. And it was extraordinary because there was a full day devoted to happiness, which we haven't seen before at the summit. And during that summit, we heard from Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the World Economic Forum, that the current economic system is failing. We need new human-centered thinking, considering happiness, well-being, purpose, and meaning. So this is from the World Economic Forum. And he was asked by the audience, you know, you have all the government leaders assembled here. What advice would you give? There was just time for one question at the end of his keynote. What advice would you give to government leaders? And his words were really interesting. He said that in these times, leaders will need to make courageous decisions that sometimes appear to compromise the short-term interests of their own country, but actually are in the long-term interests of our survival as a global community. So he was talking about global consciousness among leaders and long-term vision. So I think that's something for us to reflect on as we speak about conscious leadership. It was interesting that much as we are going to be doing here at SALT, the morning session started off with mindfulness, not something you would maybe expect to see in an Arab country, but people were meditating in the morning, recognizing that if we're going to build a mindful and compassionate economy, we have to start with ourselves. It was interesting that some of the presentations talked about the robot age, the robotic age, where jobs will be increasingly given over to mechanization, and the importance of human compassion and consciousness as a skill that we will need in order to compete in this new economy. So just an overview of how G&H is being applied in business by first looking at how it's applied in Bhutan. There is the vision, as I said, development with values, focusing on happiness. There's measurement, the 9 domains that I talked about in a national survey that happens every 3 years to know if the government's going on track. And then there's policy making. The G&H Commission, which is like the planning commission of a country, looks at those 9 domains as they make decisions, whether to build a dam, whether to support agriculture, whether to build roads. What are the impacts on those 9 domains? And then finally, action. How do you bring it to the grassroots? How do you change mindsets so that G&H doesn't remain just in the stratosphere, but is actually part of people's DNA? The Prime Minister of Bhutan in Dubai spoke about bringing G&H into business. He said, why not bring these 9 domains measurements into a business and see how it can shape the direction of a business? And that indeed is what we've been trying to do in Thailand. I'll spend the last few minutes describing this work, which is still very much in its early stages, but I feel like is an exciting experiment in trying to bring these values into business. A little bit about Eileen Fisher Company. Eileen Fisher came to Bhutan with one of our G&H programs, and she's already had a very bold vision of sustainability and is a large clothing company in the US. But following her visit to Bhutan, said she would like to bring the values of G&H into their whole chain, into their whole way of being, and even try to experiment with some of the 9 domains measures. When asked why, she says, happiness and success are related. We're successful financially, but we're also pretty stressed out. And we're not sure that all our workers are happy. Should we be measuring something beyond financial results? And I love this quote from her: we want to be a great company more than we want to be a big company. She was awarded a B Corp status in 2016. It's a company that's legally allowed to follow not just profit, but their impact on sustainability and social causes. So recognition for their attempt to do this. And their campaign towards sustainability is also looking at conscious business practices and worker and community happiness. So again, trying to shape the direction that business is moving. And finally, about Grimm, a large family-owned company in Thailand, working in all the sectors that you see up there, and a long history of wanting to do business with compassion and working in the CSR field, doing a lot to contribute to Thailand in corporate social responsibility. But interested in G&H, a neighboring country to Bhutan, very interested in the philosophy and very concerned about sustainability. So we were invited to work there with Grimm. And initially they took us to speak to business leaders in Thailand, which included the Board of Trade, the Federation of Thai Industries, Young Presidents Organization. And we got a lot of feedback from them about what some of the challenges or inspirations around G&H might look like. Over the course of the last year, we've been gradually introducing G&H values and measures into the company. We've been doing a series of training modules for executives and employees. Over the course of a year, they would go through 3 modules, and that's followed up by on-site support and coaching from our G&H master trainers. We've been using the approach of both the inner and outer approach to happiness, so cultivating happiness skills through deep listening, conflict resolution, social and emotional learning, and different practices also from Theory U and the Presencing Institute in the business environment, but also looking at how can we improve the outer environment in which people are working using the 9 domains. So for example, health, psychological well-being, the community and the culture of the business. These are areas that we've been asking them, where can they improve? How can we help them to improve? And the company has been introducing G&H into their corporate philosophies. They've really tried to incorporate it into their vision, right into the DNA level. These are the 4 pillars of G&H on the corners there. And they've expanded their vision from doing business with compassion to doing business with compassion for the development of civilization in harmony with nature. So expanding the concern of their business focus. In many of our workshops, we connect people again to the sense of connecting to oneself, others, and nature. This is a slide here that shows an executive and an employee talking together and practicing deep listening in a way that they would not have done in the office before, really taking turns to listen to each other's concerns. Many of them live in cars that are stuck in rush hour traffic coming between home and the office. And yet Thailand is an extraordinarily lush and beautiful country, yet many of them have lost contact with nature. We try to spend some time in nature as part of our training modules. We actually confiscate their cell phones before they go out for a half day. They drop it into a basket. Many of them experience extreme anxiety at that point. We ask them to take off their shoes and to walk on the grass. And for many of them, this is the first time they've done that since they were a child. And some of them are in tears. And you wonder, how are CEOs of companies going to care about the environment and make policies in favor of the environment if they haven't had that kind of connection with nature in a very long time? More and more, we're working with their HR department to align G&H principles into their training and development program. So it becomes in harmony with how people are brought into the company, the skills that they're learning, how teams work together. And in the coming year, we're going to be adapting the 9 domains of G&H, the measurements, into key performance indicators and into the employee engagement survey, and even trying to adapt the G&H screening tool into decision-making processes in the business, so that when they're considering a business decision, they'll look at not just the financial outcomes, but what will be the impact on the communities, on living standards, on education, on health, as a way of making a more balanced decision. Recently, we've been having a Sustainable Brands Leaders journey in Bhutan with Thai business leaders. We'll be expanding that to include international business leaders in the coming year, and also doing more G&H master classes, so training people from different walks of life in how they implement this in their own context. So just some emerging lessons. I think this is a new field. I'd say watch this space. We're learning as we go along. But shifting the playing field and shifting what we measure as a sign of success is, I think, what G&H can contribute in terms of measurement. So not just the financial success of the company, but how are we doing in terms of G&H? I think a common misconception is that G&H is anti-growth, but in fact it's saying how much growth and how much growth and what kind of growth are we measuring and is important for a company. We're taking a stepwise approach, so working with executives and leadership. Their buy-in has been really critical to even get this on the ground. And we're trying to work on both the inner transformation and shifting the outer environment of the business as that approach. We're also trying to balance the idea of adaptation and authenticity. So how do you take this to a new country and to a business context while still staying true to the vision of G&H as it was articulated by the fourth king of Bhutan? And then finally, the importance of creating partnerships. I think in order for companies who want to experiment in this way, there needs to be a branding and marketing similar to B Corp that says companies that are doing this, this is why they're doing it. This is why their products are things that you should be looking at. And finally, one of our ministers said, Bhutan cannot be a G&H bubble in a GDP world. Even if you were to look at the impact of climate change, Bhutan has pledged to remain 60% under forest cover forever. And we are a not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative country. And yet, if global warming continues in other countries, in our neighboring countries, we are at a huge risk because of the breaking of watersheds and flooding into Bhutan. So this needs to be a global movement. This needs to be other countries, other people, not necessarily pursuing G&H the way it is measured in Bhutan, but adapting the ideas concerned with happiness and well-being, concerned with sustainability in business. And that's why I think conferences like Wisdom Together that are built on deep friendship and trust between individuals, that are bringing together like-minded people, are so important in this time that we're living in. I would like to end with a quote from Arne Ness, who really puts it into perspective, our interconnectedness and our being conscious of our place in the universe. And he said, "The smaller we come to feel ourselves compared to the mountain, the nearer we come to participating in its greatness." So I hope we all feel a little bit closer to that greatness and that we'll share that over the coming few days. Thank you very much.